Tonight, we're going to take a slow look at the story of the Huntress in Dead by Daylight. She is one of the most recognizable killers in the entire game. The mask, the humming, the way she appears between the trees. Even people who do not know much about her lore usually remember the feeling she gives off. There is something different about her. She is not just aggressive. She is not just frightening. She feels lonely, ancient almost, like someone who has been separated from the rest of the world for far too long. And that feeling is a big part of why her story works so well. Because when you really look at the Huntress, you do not just see a killer. You see a person who is shaped by isolation, by loss, by survival, and by a life so far removed from ordinary human connection that, over time, she became something almost mythic. Her real name was Anna. And long before the fog took her, long before the trials, she was simply a child growing up in a brutal and lonely world. So in this video, we're going to go through her story slowly. We will talk about where she came from, what happened to her when she was young, how she survived, how she changed, and why she eventually became one of the most tragic figures in Dead by Daylight lore. This is not a fast explanation. This is meant to be calm, something you can listen to quietly. So settle in, and let's begin at the start. Part 2. The world Anna was born into. Anna was born in the deep wilderness of northern Russia. Right away, that matters, because her story does not begin in a town. It does not begin in a normal home. It does not begin anywhere close to comfort, community, or safety. It begins in the forest. Cold land, long winters, silence, distance, a place where nature did not care whether you lived or died. That was the world she entered. And in a way, that world never really left her. When most people grow up, they learn how to exist around others. They learn routines, rules, language shaped by daily contact. Even when life is hard, there is usually still some structure, some kind of society. But Anna's life did not form that way. She was raised far away from ordinary civilization, far away from the kind of world that teaches empathy through community or stability through routine. Instead, she learned something much harsher. She learned survival. And survival, by itself, is not gentle. It teaches you to notice danger, to react quickly, to trust what keeps you alive, to care about hunger, weather, sound, and movement. That kind of life shapes a person differently. And it definitely shaped Anna differently. The forest was not just scenery in her story. It was her teacher, her shelter, her threat, her whole universe. Everything important in her early life happened inside that world. Every lesson, every fear, every memory. That is part of what makes the Huntress feel so distinct, even compared to other killers. Many killers in Dead by Daylight come from broken homes, violent histories, or traumatic experiences. But Anna feels different because she almost seems to come from another reality. Not supernatural exactly, just far removed from normal human life. As if her story happened on the edge of the world. And in many ways it did. Part 3. Her mother and the shape of childhood. The most important person in Anna's early life was her mother. Their relationship defined almost everything. Her mother was not just a parent in the normal sense. She was Anna's protector, teacher, companion, and really her entire social world. There were no classrooms, no naberjots, no group of children to grow up around, no wider family to balance things out. There was just the wilderness and her mother within it. So everything Anna understood about life came through that bond. Her mother taught her how to move through the forest, how to track, how to hunt, how to stay alive, how to listen, how to endure. And those lessons mattered because in that environment, they were not hobbies. They were necessary. You did not learn to hunt for sport. You learned because hunger was real. You did not learn caution as a personality trait. You learned it because carelessness could kill you. That means Anna's childhood was shaped by harsh reality from the beginning. But even with that harshness, there was still attachment. There was still love in the only form her life really allowed. And that matters a lot. Because when a child is only one real emotional anchor in the world, losing that person becomes catastrophic. It does not just create grief. It can break the structure of the self. And in Anna's case, that is more or less what happened. Before we even get to that loss, though, it helps to sit with what her early life must have felt like. Long stretches of quiet, snow, trees moving in the wind, animal sounds in the distance. A mother who is both nurturing and severe. A life where tenderness and brutality are mixed together because survival leaves very little room between them. That is the emotional atmosphere of honest childhood. Not completely loveless, but never safe in the way most childhoods are meant to be safe. Even before tragedy fully enters the picture, her life is already narrow, already isolated, already forming around instincts that would separate her from other people later on. Part 4. Learning survival before learning humanity. One of the saddest things about Anna's story is that she learned how to survive before she ever really learned how to belong. That difference matters a lot because surviving and belonging are not the same thing. A person can become extremely good at enduring pain, hunger, cold, and fear, and still never learn how to connect to others in a healthy way. Anna became strong, resourceful, patient, quiet, observant. Everything about her environment rewarded those traits. If she paid attention, she lived. If she adapted, she lived. If she endured, she lived. So naturally, those parts of her became stronger and stronger. But what did not grow in the same way were the parts built through wider human contact. Trust in strangers, a stable sense of morality shaped by community, comfort around people, a normal understanding of affection, a feeling that the world was larger than the forest and the small life she knew. Those things never had much room to develop. That is part of why the Huntress can feel tragic without ever feeling innocent. She is not written as someone who had a normal chance at life and then randomly chose evil. Her story is darker than that. It is about a human being whose entire development happened under conditions that distorted almost everything. By the time most children are learning who they are through play, school, and family life, Anna is learning how to survive in the wilderness. By the time most people begin building memories connected to normal community, Anna is building memories tied to caution, silence, blood, and the hunt. And because this begins so early, it becomes normal to her. That may be the most important point of all. What feels extreme to us was ordinary to her. The quiet, the death, the chase, the need to stay alert. Those things were not interruptions in her life. They were her life. So already, before her story reaches its breaking point, the foundation is unstable. Not because she was born monstrous, but because her world gave her almost no path toward becoming ordinary. Part 5. The loss that changed everything. At some point during Anna's youth, the central tragedy of her life takes place. Her mother dies, and from that moment on, everything changes. Different retellings and interpretations focus on different details around the event, but the emotional truth is the same. Anna loses the one person who connected her to love, guidance, and identity. In a more normal life, the death of a parent is already devastating. In Anna's life, it is even worse. Because her mother was not one important person among many. She was almost everything. She was family. She was safety. She was structure. She was the voice that explained the world. And once that voice was gone, there was nothing there to replace it. No village stepped in. No relatives came looking. No community carried her through grief. There was only absence in the forest. That kind of loss is hard to overstate. It is not just sadness. It is disorientation, a tearing away of the only stable emotional center a person has. For Anna, grief did not happen in a safe place. It happened in isolation, which means there was no healthy way to process it. No language for it, no comfort for it, no one to witness it. She simply had to continue. And continuing, in her case, meant surviving alone. This is where her story stops feeling like a harsh childhood and starts feeling like the origin of something much darker. Because being left alone in the wilderness as a child does more than make someone lonely. It changes what they become. The world hardens around them, and eventually they harden with it. Anna had already learned the mechanics of survival. Now, she had to live them without the one person who taught them to her. So what remained was instinct without warmth, memory without comfort, love without any safe place to go. And that is the beginning of the person who would later become a huntress. Part 6. Alone in the Wilderness. After her mother's death, Anna remains in the forest. And that is where the next stage of her life begins. Not with healing, not with rescue, not with any return to ordinary life. Just survival, day after day, season after season. Alone, that kind of existence changes a person slowly. Maybe not all at once. Maybe not in a way you would notice from one week to the next. But over years, it becomes everything. At first, you can imagine a child still carrying traces of who she once was, still remembering comfort, still holding on to fragments of safety, still expecting, in some quiet part of herself, that the world might somehow return what it took from her. But time wears those things down, especially in isolation, especially when there is no one there to interrupt the change. Anna grows older in that environment, and as she does, survival becomes less of a temporary condition and more of a permanent identity. She is no longer just a girl trying to endure. She is becoming a creature of the woods. Her senses sharpen, her patience deepens, her knowledge of the land grows more complete. She learns how to move through the wilderness almost like part of it. She learns where animals travel, how weather shifts, how to wait, how to listen, how to strike. And because there is no outside life pulling her back toward human society, all of those abilities keep strengthening in the same direction. There is no counterbalance, no normal life developing beside the wild one. Only the wild one. That is important, because when people talk about the huntress as if she simply became savage, that misses something. Savagery suggests a fall from civilization, but Anna barely had civilization to fall from in the first place. What happened to her feels more like a human life being swallowed by an environment that never allowed softness to survive for long. The forest kept shaping her, and she kept adapting to it, until the difference between person and predator began to blur. Part 7. Growing into strength, silence, and ritual. As Anna grows into adulthood, she becomes physically imposing and deeply capable. She is no longer just surviving by instinct alone. She is surviving by mastery. She knows the forest. She understands movement. She understands fear. She understands pursuit. That matters because hunting, over time, becomes more than a practical skill. It becomes ritual, routine, identity. The repetition of it shapes her. Tracking, waiting, closing distance, throwing, killing, doing what must be done again and again until it is no longer separate from who she is. And in a strange way, repetition can become its own kind of world. For someone living alone, routines are not just habits. They are structure. They replace the schedules, relationships, and social rhythms that other people take for granted. So Anna's life begins to organize itself around these patterns. Hunt, carry, eat, rest, watch, repeat. It is simple, but it is not peaceful, because beneath that routine is the fact that she is still alone, still emotionally stranded in a life that never moved forward in any healthy sense. And when loneliness sits inside someone for too long, it does not always stay quiet. Sometimes it twists. Sometimes it looks for substitutes. Sometimes it reaches outward in ways that are desperate, broken, and deeply disturbing. That is one of the reasons the Huntress is such an unsettling character. The horror around her is not only physical, it is emotional. You can feel that something inside her has been frozen for years. Not dead exactly, but damaged in a way that never had the chance to heal. She lives, she hunts, she grows stronger, but strength is not the same as wholeness. And survival is not the same as peace. By this point in her story, Anna is no longer simply a tragic child. She is becoming the version of herself that legends will fear. Still human, still carrying traces of memory, but moving farther and farther away from the kind of life that would let those memories soften her. Part 8. The need for connection never fully died. One of the most disturbing parts of Anna's lore is also one of the saddest. For all the ways she changed, the need for connection never fully left her. The need stayed inside her, damaged, twisted, half-buried, but still there. And because it remained there without any healthy way to express itself, it eventually came out in terrible ways. In the lore, Anna becomes associated with the abduction of young girls from nearby villages. This is one of those parts of the story that feels especially dark because it suggests something more complex than pure bloodlust. It suggests longing, a broken attempt to recreate something. Maybe family, maybe innocence, maybe the bond she lost when her mother died. That does not make her actions any less horrifying. If anything, it makes them more unsettling, because it means her violence is mixed with emotional fracture. She is not just destroying, she is reaching. But she is reaching through the mind of someone who no longer understands connection in a normal human way. That is why this part of her story feels so tragic. There's a kind of absence at the center of it, a hole left by grief and years of total isolation. And every attempt to fill that absence only creates more suffering. You can almost imagine the logic in the most broken possible form. A child who lost her mother, a woman who never recovered from that loss, a life without companionship, a mind that still wants closeness but no longer knows how closeness is supposed to work. So she creates something false, something stolen, something doomed from the beginning. And of course it cannot last, because whatever tenderness once existed in her has long since been fused with violence, possession, and fear. This is where Anna stops feeling like someone who is merely shaped by the wilderness and starts feeling like someone haunted by an unending emotional wound. Not healed, not forgotten, just repeated in uglier and uglier forms. And that may be one of the most human things about her, even though it leads to monstrous behavior. People do not become less dangerous just because their pain is understandable. Sometimes understandable pain is exactly what makes them more dangerous. Part 9. The villagers, the rumors, and the birth of legend. Over time, stories begin to spread. People disappear. Children vanish. The woods become associated with danger. And Anna, who has been living beyond the edges of normal life for years, starts to become something else in the eyes of others. Not simply a woman, not even simply a murderer, a presence, a rumor, a warning. This transformation matters a lot, because legends often begin when fear fills in the gaps left by incomplete understanding. Most people do not need the full truth to become terrified. They only need signs, a sound in the trees, a child who never returns, a shape glimpsed at a distance, a place everyone learns to avoid. That is how myth begins, and Anna is perfectly suited for that kind of myth. She's already hard to place in ordinary human terms. She lives outside society. She moves through the forest with unnatural patience. She does not announce herself like a brute. She appears more like a force waiting just beyond sight. So the villagers do what people always do when faced with something they cannot fully explain. They turn it into story. And stories do two things at once. They distort the truth, and they preserve it. The exact details may shift from person to person, but the feeling stays the same. There's something in those woods, something that hunts, something that takes, something that does not belong to ordinary life. That is where Anna's identity begins to split. To herself, maybe she's still just living the only life she knows, still following instinct, still repeating the same patterns that kept her alive. But to everyone else, she is becoming a nightmare, a tale told in fear, a shape that moves between human and inhuman. This is one of the reasons her lore works so well in Dead by Daylight. She does not need excessive supernatural detail to feel eerie. She already feels unreal simply because of how completely she has drifted from normal human existence. By the time the world starts speaking of her like a monster, the tragic part is that there's almost no one left who could have spoken to her as a person. That possibility disappeared a long time ago. Part 10: The Rabbit Mask and the Humming. If the Huntress only had a tragic backstory, she would still be memorable. But what really locks her into people's minds are the details. The rabbit mask, the humming, the strange mix of softness and terror. Those pieces matter because they make her feel symbolically rich, not just violent. Start with the mask. Rabbits are usually associated with vulnerability, with childhood, with softness. They're not the kind of animal most people connect with a towering killer in the woods. And that contrast is exactly what makes it work. On Anna, the rabbit mask feels wrong. It feels theatrical, unsettling, like a child's object carried into a world of blood and death. It creates an immediate tension between innocence and brutality, and that tension reflects her story almost perfectly. There are traces of arrested childhood in her, traces of tenderness that never developed properly, traces of emotional need that were never given a healthy shape. The mask feels like one more sign of that damaged interior life. Not because it excuses anything, but because it suggests that the violence we see is layered over something older, something broken long before the killings. Then there is the humming. In the game, the Huntress lullaby is one of the most effective sound cues in all of Dead by Daylight. It is not loud. It is not chaotic. It is intimate. And that intimacy is what makes it so uncomfortable. A lullaby is supposed to calm, to comfort, to protect. But with Anna, it does the opposite. It warns you that something is near, something maternal in form, but lethal in reality. That inversion is brilliant. It takes one of the softest human sounds and turns it into dread. And again, it fits the lore, because Anna is a character full of inversions. She is a woman shaped by nurture and violence at the same time. A figure connected to childhood, but only through trauma and distortion. Someone whose gestures can seem almost caring, right up until they become deadly. The mask and the lullaby are not just cool design choices. They are the emotional shorthand of her entire story. You look at them or hear them, and without even reading the lore, you can already feel that something inside this character went wrong a very long time ago. Part 11: Why the Huntress feels so different from other killers. One reason the Huntress stands out so much is that she does not feel evil in a simple way. She is dangerous, violent, relentless, but she does not feel flat. She feels layered, and that layered feeling is what makes her linger in people's minds. A lot of horror characters are built around one dominant trait: cruelty, rage, sadism, revenge, and those can work. But Anna feels more complicated than that. Her story is not really about ambition. It is not about greed. It is not even mainly about revenge. Instead, her story is about distortion. What happens when a human life develops in the wrong conditions for too long? What happens when grief never gets processed? What happens when loneliness hardens into identity? That kind of horror is quieter, but in some ways, it is more effective, because it feels less like a fantasy of evil and more like a tragedy that curdled into something monstrous. She also stands out because so much of her fear factor comes from atmosphere instead of explanation. You do not need to memorize every detail of her lore to understand her emotionally. You hear the humming, you see the mask, you watch the way she moves through the woods, and you immediately understand that this is someone shaped by isolation. Someone whose inner life is damaged in a way that has become visible on the outside. That is good character design, and it is also good storytelling, because even without words, the Huntress communicates who she is. She's the kind of killer who feels like she belongs to old stories. The thing in the woods, the woman no one can reason with, the figure children are warned about, the hunter who hears you before you hear her. That mythic feeling gives her a different weight than killers who are more grounded in modern revenge or flashy cruelty. She feels timeless, Not ancient in a literal supernatural sense, just old in the emotional sense. Like she belongs to a much older kind of fear. And maybe that is why people keep coming back to her lore. Because underneath the weapons and the violence, there's the shape of an old human sadness. One that never healed. One that had nowhere to go. Part 12. The entity did not need to change her much. When Anna is eventually taken by the entity, it almost feels less like a transformation and more like a continuation. That is one of the bleakest things about her story. For some killers in Dead by Daylight, the entity represents a dramatic shift, a final corruption, a twisting of who they were into something darker. But with the Huntress, the transition feels almost natural. Not because she was already part of the supernatural world, but because she was already living in ritualized violence. Already hunting, already isolated, already detached from ordinary human life. The entity thrives on repetition, chase, capture, sacrifice, again and again. And Anna was already a creature of repetition long before she entered the fog. The hunt had already defined her. The wilderness had already separated her from everyone else. The emotional damage had already taken root. So when the entity pulls her into its realm, it is not inventing a killer from nothing. It is taking someone who has already been shaped into the right kind of instrument. That is what makes her story feel so hopeless. You can imagine another life for some characters, another version of events, a path where one decision changed and everything turned out differently. With Anna, that alternate life starts to feel harder and harder to picture the older she gets. The tragedy happens early, and then it keeps echoing. By the time the entity enters the picture, the damage is already deep. The trials simply give that damage a new setting, a new structure, a new endless routine. In the fog, she becomes what she already was in another form. A hunter moving through controlled spaces, listening, tracking, closing in. The difference is that now the cycle never ends. And maybe that is why she fits the game so perfectly. Because Dead by Daylight is, in many ways, a machine built from repeated trauma. The same fear, the same pursuit, the same violence. Again and again. Anna belongs there because repetition already ruled her life. The entity just made that repetition eternal. Part 13. The tragedy at the center of her story. If you strip away the gameplay, the powers, the cosmetics, and the iconography, what remains at the center of the Huntress is tragedy. Not tragedy in the sense that she should be pitted without judgment, and not tragedy in the sense that suffering excuses harm. That is not the point. The point is that her story is built around irreversible damage. A child raised in isolation. A world defined by cold survival. A mother lost too early. A life with no one to interrupt the descent. That combination creates a kind of emotional inevitability. Not destiny, exactly, but narrowing. The possible futures get smaller and smaller. The paths toward health disappear one at a time. And what remains is a person who keeps living, but in a way that becomes more warped with every passing year. That is what makes Anna feel tragic rather than merely cruel. Cruelty by itself is simple. Tragedy is something else. It asks you to imagine what was lost, what might have been, what never had the chance to fully form. And with Anna, there's a sense that a whole human self never got to finish becoming. Something essential in her development was interrupted, then frozen, then twisted. That does not make her safe. It does not make her innocent. But it does make her sad in a way many killers are not. And sadness can make horror hit harder. Because horror is often most effective when it is close to grief. When it feels like it came from some real human wound rather than abstract evil. The Huntress carries that feeling more strongly than most. She is frightening, yes. But more than that, she feels like the aftermath of something that should never have happened. A life abandoned to conditions no child should have to endure, and then left there long enough to become a nightmare. Part 14. Why our lore works so well for Dead by Daylight. Dead by Daylight works best, at least in my opinion, when it turns a strong visual horror concept into something emotionally heavier. Not just a cool design, not just a power set, but a real story that gives the design depth. And the Huntress is one of the clearest examples of that. On the surface, the concept is simple. A woman in the woods, a mask, hatchets, humming. That already works. It is already creepy, but the lore turns that into something much more memorable. Now the humming means something. Now the mask means something. Now the forest means something. Now the hunt is connected to loneliness, grief, and emotional damage. That extra weight is what makes a killer stick in people's minds long after the match ends. It is also what makes her such a strong fit for slow lore content. Her story has room to breathe, room for atmosphere, room for reflection. Not because every detail is complicated, but because the emotional shape of it is rich. There are simple killers whose stories are mostly about a single event. Anna's story feels broader. It feels like an entire life bent out of shape that give you more to think about, more to interpret, more to return to. And it makes her one of the original killers that people still talk about the most. Because she is not just recognizable, she is memorable for a reason. She hits several fears at once. The fear of being hunted, the fear of isolation, the fear of losing yourself, the fear of someone who wants connection, but has become too broken to express it safely. That combination is powerful and honestly kind of timeless. It does not depend on trends. It does not need complicated lore mechanics. It just works. A damaged human being, a dark forest, and a life that slowly collapses into ritualized violence. That is enough. More than enough, really. Part 15. Slow ending and reflection. So in the end, the Huntress is not just a killer with a memorable sound cue and a strong design. She is the final shape of a life built in the wrong conditions. A child raised far from ordinary life. A daughter who lost the only person anchoring her to love. A survivor who learned strength without learning peace. And eventually, a legend whispered about by people who only ever saw the horror left behind. That is why she stays interesting. Because even after you understand the basics of her story, the feeling of it stays with you. The loneliness, the stillness, the sense that everything went wrong very early and nothing ever arrived to set it right. There's a kind of emptiness around her that never really goes away. Even when she becomes powerful, even when she becomes feared, even when she becomes, in some sense, larger than life. That emptiness remains. And maybe that is what people hear underneath the lullaby. Not just menace, not just warning, but absence. A human life hollowed out by grief and isolation, then turned into something the world can only describe as monstrous. In Dead by Daylight, a lot of killers are terrifying because of what they do. The Huntress is terrifying because of what she became. And she became that way slowly, quietly. One loss, one season, one lonely year at a time. That kind of horror is hard to shake because it feels patient, it feels old, and it feels sad. So if you think about the Huntress as more than just a gameplay threat, that is probably the version of her worth remembering. Not only the hunter in the mask, but Anna, the child in the wilderness, the daughter who never found her way back, and the woman who was eventually swallowed by the same loneliness that taught her how to survive. That is the full story of the Huntress, or at least the slow version of it.